Welcome to the Motley Mystic Podcast. I'm Candace Shalhoub. I've named this podcast and Substack the Motley Mystic because I believe truth speaks with many, sometimes motley, voices. Dogmas and doctrines have crept in to make religion into a rigid thing all about belief, but as a motley mystic, I feel spirituality should be less about belief and more about that deep knowing that we are more than these bodies, more than these thoughts, and definitely far more than our beliefs or opinions. Indeed, we are all collections of motley beliefs and ideas, and if that's an idea that resonates with you, you could also be a motley mystic. Here's the latest Motley Mystic Substack post. God's got some splainin to do. Spoiler alert, you won't like the answers. A friend of mine recently remarked, "When I get to see God face to face, I have a lot of questions." Those questions all revolved around the issue of human suffering, why God allows it and why God won't stop it, mainly. I admit I've had the same thought that God's got a lot of splainin to do when I leave this bodily world and no longer see through a glass darkly. There are those who have tried to answer this question about suffering and why it happens to we humans. The Buddha, of course, concluded that all of life is suffering. If you're here, incarnated in a body, get ready, suffering is on the way. The only way to avoid it, he says, is to rid yourself of desire. Or, as A Course in Miracles puts it in chapter 16, your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all barriers within yourself that you have built against it. Hindu guru Paramahamsa Yogananda speaks of life as a play, with God as the playwright. His disciple Kriyananda writes, in the essence of the Bhagavad Gita, a playwright knows that actors portraying both good and evil are necessary to his story. Without the presence of what teacher Ashanaya Swami calls God's rowdy children, a play would be a terribly boring thing. We're in this world to learn lessons, to heal any karma we've created in this life or from prior ones if you're given to believing in reincarnation. Either way, this life is our classroom, and the world around us merely the scene and the stage on which we act out our lessons. God creates characters that appear both good and evil in this play of life, as Kriyananda explains. God knows that a good villain, he writes, quote, will only make the conclusion of the story more beautiful, unquote. On our stage right now are some incredibly convincing villains who have struck fear in our hearts. As Yogananda once said, the villain is needed in a play to make us love the hero, which is to say, to help us reject the ego as our driving force and instead seek to connect with that higher divine self. Villainy, though, is needed, even within our own hearts, Kriyananda adds, quote, to bring one to the point where he realizes that doing harm to others never succeeded in bringing him happiness, nor was there any real fulfillment for him until he learned to offer up his ego to a more expanded peace and harmony, unquote. And truly, I hope this is what is happening within the hearts and minds of God's rowdy children that we consider villainous in our own time. They hopefully are learning that their creation of suffering for others, and in turn themselves, in this world will never lead to their ultimate happiness, even as they play their villainous parts very well in this lifetime. I doubt, though, that this explanation for suffering would satisfy my friend. But there's another answer, as Kriyananda writes, quote, the little child cannot know why the parent must leave home daily to work he has yet to achieve an adult point of view, unquote. Indeed, our childish, egoic thoughts are nothing like God's, so understanding the universe's idea of how things should be truly is beyond us. Still another answer is given this way by Kriyananda. Quote, the scriptures say that God creates the universe in order to enjoy himself through many. Certainly, the Lord does not enjoy the fact that his creatures suffer. His enjoyment then must come outwardly from seeing every story come at last to a happy ending as his human creatures attain final release one by one from ego limitation and infinite bliss. He wants us to merge back eventually into this ocean of Satchidananda, unquote. And Satchidananda is defined as ever-existing, ever-conscious, ever-new bliss. Now, honestly, I doubt that any of these explanations would satisfy my friend, but as my mama always said, life isn't fair. The reality is we have chosen this time and place as our classroom, even if we don't fully understand how all this works. Asking why all the suffering around us happens and why it persists is to miss the point of being here. Should we work to alleviate suffering? Oh, of course, but we should only do that in ways that are truly effective by going within first, learning our own lessons, dispelling our own karma. It is only the self-realized person who first alleviates their own root of suffering that can truly help others ease, indeed be free of, their own suffering. This isn't a satisfactory answer either. But here's the thing. There never will be a satisfactory answer. The ego makes sure of that. If the ego can keep us worrying about suffering, that is to say, if the ego can keep us suffering, then we'll always be too busy suffering to find the cure. We think the advice to go within is an instruction to withdraw from the world, to be indifferent to suffering. But on the contrary, going within is the only way to be free from suffering. Because if you free yourself from suffering in the only world you can control, the one within, then you end suffering without. Because if no one suffers within, then there's no suffering to project onto the world. And the ego knows this is true, which is why it will never accept a spiritual solution to what it will always insist is a bodily problem. This is the truth of the matter. We are all energy. Therefore, suffering is created whenever we use our life force, our energy, to worry, to be selfish, to be greedy, to blame others for all of our perceived problems or shortcomings. We project that inner disturbance outward, and we produce suffering all around us. On some level, we all know that going within is the only acceptable answer. But we love the ego's world so much. It's so much easier to blame others for the suffering we see. It is easier to seek to dethrone despots and wage war on those evil people we see around us than it is to fight the battle against the ego within our own heart and mind. The truth is that the inner battlefield frightens us far more than actually taking up arms against our bodily neighbors. This is why saying the only way to gain freedom from suffering in the world is to end it within first is not a satisfactory answer. We, like the warrior Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, who faces this battle against his kinfolk, we are loath to fight that inner battle. We love our ego. It is, after all, an integral part of us. And though it is the source of our suffering, conquering it, in some ways it feels cruel because it's part of our inner family. So how then do we defeat the armies of egoic suffering within ourselves? First, we stop listening to the voice of the ego that demands God explain why the world is such a terrible place. Instead, we listen to what A Course tells us in Chapter 5 is the call to joy that we all have within us. A Course explains that when the ego was created, by the way, it came to be when our higher divine self entered the body, and it allows us to exist in this bodily world. In that moment, God also created within us a call to joy. This call to joy is the same as that ocean of Satchidananda, that ever-existing, ever-conscious, ever-new bliss that the Holy wants us to merge back into. When we listen only to this call to joy, A Course says, the ego always dissolves at its sound. This inner battle with our ego doesn't have to be won by doing violence to ourselves, by using the force of our will to overcome bad habits or our selfish or hateful thoughts or actions. Instead, all we have to do is listen to the call to joy, to hear it instruct us on how to remove the barriers to love that keep us locked in ego consciousness. So how do we do that? Well, that's a matter of devotion, according to A Course, as well as the Gita. Right now, I would say that the majority of us are devoted to the needs and desires of our ego. We seek self-satisfaction in things of this world, whether they're possessions, power, wealth, respect, or a good reputation. Everything in this life is transactional as the ego seeks its next brief hit of happiness before moving on to the next scheme. If we shift our devotion, however, away from ego and to the spirit, we can begin to remove those barriers that bind us to egoic fear and let love prevail instead. Well, so how do you do that? By becoming what A Course calls wholly helpful. That's wholly, W-H-O-L-L-Y, not H-O-L-Y, but becoming wholly, completely helpful. As Kriyananda puts it, when we embark on a spiritual path, it, quote, imposes also the broader responsibility of helping others spiritually. One should not live for himself alone, unquote. It reminds me of the Netflix series New Amsterdam. It was a hospital drama where the new medical director is seen as unorthodox, dangerous even, because his guiding principle is one question: how can I help? Indeed, some of his ways of insisting on helping seem to create more chaos and suffering than his solutions alleviated. That fact holds a lesson that we all need to learn. Asha Nayaswamy, in one of her talks, describes how she inserted herself into the lives of her aging parents with the good intentions of helping them as they faced mental and physical decline. Eventually, though, she realized her, quote, help wasn't helpful at all. Instead, she was preventing them from doing the necessary work in this classroom of life to heal their own karma. This is the lesson she learned. If we take over for someone and prevent them from suffering, are we helping them? I mean, if karma is an unlearned lesson and life is bringing a lesson to someone and we interrupt it, are we really helping? We're all here to repair our karma, to learn lessons so we don't have to repeat them. Often, though, in an attempt to help, we may be interfering with a lesson that needs to be learned so someone else's karma can be healed. It doesn't mean we don't seek to help, but we must allow people to go through the lessons they need to learn. And perhaps a key to understanding when it's appropriate to help is to ask ourselves if we're stepping in and taking over for someone who has not sought our help, or if we're responding to a true call for help. Commandeering another person's life, even if they allow you to do it, is probably the big red flag that you're interfering with a valuable lesson that they need to learn. As Asha explains, if the result of this suffering is that this person will come to know a freedom and a power and a happiness that they would never be able to reach if they didn't face into this karma, accept what they have to learn and learn it, would you want them not to have that opportunity to learn? This way of living would definitely not satisfy my friend's search for an explanation of suffering. I can hear her protesting now. If we can prevent suffering, isn't that what we're supposed to do? Well, maybe, but maybe not. We cannot end all suffering in the world, unless, of course, all of us end it within first, but that would obviously take time and devotion. Maybe being wholly helpful simply means that we be there to support others, to be with them as they endure their hardships, to hold space for them. But we should not attempt to prevent them from going through their lesson, the suffering that they have to face, because we may be hindering them from healing that karmic wound once and for all. And this is a really difficult lesson, but it's one we must learn. Suffering happens, and we can do little to stop it unless we are willing to do our inner work, to fight that inner battle with our own egoic forces by hearing only the call to joy. It is that call that gives us the strength to fight the ego and the wisdom to know how to be wholly helpful to others around us while not hindering their spiritual growth through the lessons that they are here to learn. And this is a delicate practice, but we can only be wholly helpful to others when we have been wholly helpful to ourselves by going within and becoming devoted to listening only to that call to joy. The wisdom of discernment only comes through our deep inner work. Asha would not have realized how much she was harming her parents by trying to take over their lives if she had not been doing that inner work of listening only to that call to joy. The world is very tired, a course reminds us in chapter 5, because this world is the idea of weariness, it says. Our task is the joyous one of waking up to the call for joy. What better vocation could there be, it asks. So this is our job. This is our role in the play of life, says author and teacher Michael Singer. He says, quote, your consciousness has a part to play in this universe, but it's not to get what you want. It's just to sit there and say, how can I help? How can I serve the moments unfolding in front of me? Every moment needs us, Singer says. Every moment needs us to leave it better than when we found it by hearing that call for joy within it. If every single person, he says, brought their love, their beauty, and their openness to the moment unfolding in front of you, you'd be in heaven. This then is how we alleviate suffering, by accepting our role in this play of life, to always be wholly helpful in each moment, answering that call for joy, and not interfering with the lessons of others, but by being that presence of love as they attend to their own healing. However, if all of these explanations of suffering still leave you unsatisfied, which I imagine it does, then maybe Swami Sri Yukteswar's answer can help. He said of suffering, quote, "Leave a few questions to be answered by the divine," unquote. So perhaps, after all, maybe my friend is right, that the only time we'll get a satisfying answer to the question of suffering is when we see the holy face to face. But if we spend our time now, here in this bodily world, listening to that call for joy that teaches us how to be wholly helpful in each moment, alleviating the suffering we're called to alleviate, and holding space while others work out their own karma, I suspect that we will already know the answer. Thanks for listening to the Motley Mystic Podcast. I invite you to click on the link in the show notes, leave a comment on this article. If you enjoyed this podcast and the Motley Mystic Substack, please share it with your friends so they can subscribe. Substack and the podcast are always free. If you want to know more about me, go to CandaceChallew.com. That's Candace, Candace, and Challew, CHELLEW.com. There you will find a link to my music and my book, Bulletproof Faith, a spiritual survival guide for gay and lesbian Christians. Thanks again for listening, and I'll leave you with this quote from Yogananda: "Live quietly in the moment and see the beauty of all before you. The future will take care of itself." Oh yeah.